Hello friends and welcome to another online video of Ms. Hoskins AP Environmental Science. This section is on population and community ecology. Herbivory is an interaction in which an animal consumes a producer. They typically eat only a portion of a producer without actually killing it. Like the gazelle of the African plains is known as an herbivore, and they, and a variety of species of deer, eat on plants, and they can eat a lot of the plant tissue without killing it. In an aquatic system, herbivores like sea urchins in the ocean and even tadpoles like in a pond, they consume various species of algae. So when herbivores become very abundant, they can have a dramatic effect on all these producers. And one way that they access the effects of herbivores is by excluding herbivores from an area and just seeing how things will grow back. So, for example, like when a deer is excluded from an area by putting up a high fence, scientists are commonly observed an extraordinary increase in plants. Duh, because if there's no one to eat them, then they grow back. And this all happens especially like when, you know, that that particular deer prefers that particular type of plant. But as in the case of like predators and prey, many species of producers have evolved defense mechanisms that include things like, poisons or sharp spines, and very distractful or distasteful or hurtful chemicals inside of their tissue. The list of these fascinating things that plants do to decrease herbivory is wide and extremely interesting, and one of the best specialized things in science that we still are learning about day to day. Plants cannot like run from their predators, and so some of them have evolved like very specialized ways to protect themselves. If you've never seen a sensitive plant or Mimosa pudica, it will, when brushed up against it, it will close up its leaves so that it looks very tiny and appetizing. There's also another plant, it's called stinging needles. It actually doesn't sting, it just has these little needles. Well, they're like leaf parts of their tissue that come out, and they're extremely sharp. And there's actually a histamine inside of them. And so when an animal brushes up against it or attempts to eat it, it gets a mouthful and it injects like poison inside of them, causing like almost like permanent nerve damage and death. Another example is the numb cane, which is a plants that have these blastulous cells that are on top of their tissue, and it's a very common house plant, and so I've heard lots of things about like cats and stuff eating them. But basically, if they were to eat them, they lose all loss of speech, and they can no longer talk, and they can have cardiac arrest. And they're very pretty, like common house plants. They're the great big green leafed ones that have like little white splotchy stuff. You probably see them as indoor house plants all over people's homes. I've even seen some plants that attract like a vicious species of insects that help protect it. Like for whatever reason, this one insect, it happens a lot for like fire ants in the jungle, where the one plant has evolved an exceptional food source for this particular type of wicked plant. So if an animal comes up and tries to eat the plant, it's attacked by these like fiery ant insects because they will defend their home until the death. And so it's just an interesting relationship between plant and animal that you don't see very often. Some common plants that we love to eat, like even like apples, plants contain cyanide inside of their seeds. So that's why you don't eat an apple core, and you should never take an apple and like toss it into a blender and eat it wholeheartedly, is because inside of the seeds are trapped a huge amount of cyanide and nasty cyanogens like arsenic and things like that when eaten can just kill you. Some of the flowers that I've seen before produce a digitoxin, and a digitoxin is this very vibrant, like purple colored toxin that will basically give anything with a heartbeat cardiac arrest. I think the one in the United States is called foxglove. So things just as common as even like corn plants produce these really volatile chemicals in their leaves, which is, we don't eat that part of the plant. We eat the embryo on the inside of it, the corn seeds. And that's just because the plants have these defenses that, when you can't get up and run or walk anywhere or run away, how do you protect yourself? So one of the most ecologically important interactions amongst relationships between plants and their pollinators, which include things like bats and insects and birds, is mutualism. So when the two interactions between the species of one another by help both species like increase both of their chances of survival, we call that mutualism. Sometimes species can interact in a way that benefits one species, but it doesn't have any effect on the other one. Like, for example, like tree branches that birds can just sit on. Like, the bird benefits from the presence of the tree because it provides like a perch and gets them off the floor away from predators. And however, the tree is like unaffected by what the bird is doing. When something like that happens, we call that commensalism. Commensalisms are very common in nature, more so than you think. Many species of fish use coral to hide and to avoid predators. Fish receive a major benefit from hiding, yet the coral is just like hanging out, like it's not going to grow or do anything special because the fish are there. So anyway, interactions among these species are important to determine which species can live in which community and who cannot live there. So this table summarizes the interactions and the effects that species have on each other, whether it be positive, negative, or neutral. So competition for a limiting resource has a negative effect on both the competing species, where in contrast, predation, parasitism, herbivory has a positive effect on one consumer and a negative effect on another. And mutualism can be positive for both interactions, while commensalism has a positive effect on one species and no effect on the other. A keystone species is a species that plays a far more important role in its community than any of the other relative abundant species might actually suggest. And keystone species get their name from the keystone of an arch. So without that keystone in place, the arch would fall apart. So keystone is a metaphor, and it comes from architecture. And without the keystone species, the whole system would collapse. Typically, the most abundant species or the major energy producer, while it's vital to the health of the community, is not the keystone species. Keystone species typically exist in very low numbers. And they may actually be predators. They could be the source of food. They could be the mutualistic species, or they could be providing some sort of essential resource. Beavers are an extremely good example of a keystone species. They're important to the community because they play this role in creating new pond and wetland habitats. And for a species that is not particularly abundant, the beaver has a strong influence. Just one or two animals there can change the landscape of the whole entire community. And so the presence of that organism drastically affects community. One of the other best known examples that I know of are intertidal communities, where there's a lot of rarely mobile animals like sea stars and snails, as well as dozens of other types of living creatures that attach to the rocky substrate, mussels and barnacles, and there's lots of algae there. Well, sea stars, when they're present, they prey upon mussels, and this predation continues to clear spaces where other species can grow and attach to rock. And when researchers go in and they remove sea stars from the community, then the mussels, they're no longer subjected to all that predation by the sea stars, and so they outcompete everything else in the community, and the mussels become so numerically dominant that while there's 25 other species that live there right on one particular rock, everything else declines in abundance. And thus the predatory sea star, which is not particularly numerous, it's not like you find them all over a rock, they play such a key role in reducing the really, really high superior competitor that they basically influence the whole population of that intertidal zone. Ecosystem engineers often create habitats for many other species. They find out these predator-mediated competitions by reducing the abundance of a superior competitor species, and predator-mediated competition is often essential to the survival of many populations within the community. And then they create these environments where the species can live. So sometimes ecosystem engineers can also be a keystone role in a community.